We're here today with Danny Dorling, who is Professor of Geography at Oxford University. He's written many books on inequality and explained how equality can help improve our lives and make us all happier. His latest book is Peak Inequality, and we're going to be talking about that today. Thank you for joining us, Danny.
Thank you.
How do you think public ownership can reduce inequality and give us happier lives?
If you compare the different rich countries of the world, and it's always the rich countries that we look at when we're worried about inequality because they're rich, they've got enough. The problem is sharing out. The rich countries which have more public ownership, which are mainly the Northern European and Western European countries, they tend to have much less inequality. The rich countries which believe in privatisation, where everything must be done by the private market, at the top of that is the United States, have enormous economic inequality. I mean, economic inequality you haven't seen since the 1930s. The poor are very poor in the US, and a tiny number of people are extremely rich.
Right. So can you tell us about the health systems of different countries and what it shows us about how we need to fund our health system and where the money should be going?
Yeah. The one nice thing about geography and inequality is that you've got these natural experiments. Different countries run things in different ways, and it is not that hard to work out how much of the outcome of a country is a result of how they've chosen to do things. So the United States, famously for health, spends more money on health per head than any other rich country in the world, but has the worst outcomes. I mean, it's almost as if they were doing it to show us what not to do. And the reason they have the worst outcomes is that a narrow majority of that money is spent on private healthcare. That is spent on people who are generally healthy. A lot of it's spent on cosmetic things or things you don't need. Or there's also a great incentive for doctors under a private healthcare system to say there's something wrong with you and then tell you they've cured you. It doesn't work. The United States has the lowest life expectancy of all rich countries in the world, the worst infant mortality. It's terrible. It also has quite a large state system, Medicare and Medicaid, but again that's badly managed and isn't properly controlled, and only certain people are eligible. At the other extreme, you can take the Scandinavian countries, which do very well. Or if you want to be a bit more realistic and a larger country, you can take Germany, which has a slightly two-tier system. It's not perfect or completely nice, but the key thing Germany does is they spend an extra €1 billion every week as compared to the UK. Not 350 million, it's $1 billion a week. And that billion funds your health service properly so that there are empty beds for when you need a bed. There are enough doctors when you need to go and visit a doctor and so on. France is similar, actually spends even slightly more. And the French live longer than the Germans, and the Germans live longer than us. We have a very efficient system. Now, well, we have the relics of a very efficient system in terms of the NHS, but incredibly underfunded. You can only underfund it this much because it was initially so efficient. If you were to take the US system and cut its funding down to what we spend in Britain, you'd be looking at third world conditions in the US. What you want is an efficient system in public ownership and control, but with funding at a decent and adequate level, because nothing is more important in people's lives than health.
Absolutely. Privatisation often leads to more inequality in different ways, and something you talk about in this book is the effect of both increasing student loans and privatising them. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Oh, student loans, I mean, I had to laugh because most countries in the rich world have worked out that you do not privatise student loans, and they've never done it. You don't have loans. It's not the idea that you give somebody a loan for their education is just anathema to most sensible people in the world. However, the United States, partly due to McCarthyism and other kind of weird ways of thinking in the 1950s and 60s, brought in a system where, rather than being able to go to university as a right, you had to borrow money from the federal government to go. And then, of course, the universities just begin to increase their fees higher and higher and higher because the government doesn't have to pay this. It'll be paid back by the students. So you end up with a very expensive education, not better. United States universities are not better universities than European universities. And you end up with a very unstable economic situation in which large numbers of people have these enormous debts which will chase them round to the end of their life. They can't go bankrupt. You're not allowed to go bankrupt on a student loan. Mainly the United States, but also Chile and some other South American countries tried this. They're now trying to reverse it in Chile. We were the only country in Europe that did this. We brought in a sneaky £1,000 a year fee, and then £3,000 a year, saying, oh, it won't go any higher than that. Political party promised to get rid of it. People voted for that party. That party lied. And £9,000, now £9,250 a year.
Yeah.
Unbelievable amount of money. And the quality of what you get for that money compared to a university education in Germany or France is certainly not as good. And it encourages universities to behave in really bad ways. Basically to try to get as many students as they can, to spend as little on them as you can do while pretending you're not, to lie, to advertise. And it's not education, whatever this is. I mean, it's marketing. It's a clever selling of a product and a brand, but it isn't education.
And it skews the incentives around how universities operate.
Yeah.
And it's just outrageous, isn't it? When I look at how much I'm paying compared to people who are a bit younger than me, it's so incredibly unfair.
We'll also remember that not everybody of your age is paying this. The big incentive that the government had, this is the Liberal and Conservative government had, and remember this is a government made up of very rich people. I mean, there were quite a lot of millionaires in the tiny Liberal part of this. Their children don't have loans. They quietly, when they turn up at university, they come with a cheque from their mum and dad, and they pay the $9,250 out flat.
Yeah.
So they have no debt.
Yeah.
The reason my parents wanted this system, because this is the political party of the rich, is that they wanted lower taxes. And so by getting a system where their children won't get into debt, but you're going to have to pay, depending on your income in the future, for 30 years. You may have to pay 50, 60, 70, and if you get yourself a well-paid job, £100,000. They'll only ever pay £27,000. It's really socially unjust. The rich benefit. The student loan system is a benefit for the very, very richest tenth of students, about a tenth who mum and dad pay. And they begin to lie from an early age. You turn up to university, you pay the cheque, somebody says, student loans are terrible, and you say, oh yes, my loan's terrible. I haven't got a loan. It's an awful situation. The other thing that happened in Britain was that all universities immediately charged the top, because there's an idea that the more you spend, the better it is. So they all charged 9,000. The sector got an extra £1 billion. That was spent on the salaries of the people running universities and the senior management teams and a few buildings. And then they get used to it. They get used to a salary of £300,000, £400,000. People just below a vice-chancellor says, oh, you can't possibly do this job for less than £250,000. It's like running in a business. And it stops being a university.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've talked about how the top 1% in particular sort of manage the education system, whereby, you know, they might get involved in being in an academy trust kind of for fun on the side, while their children are obviously benefiting from the best private schools.
Oh, well, this is a privatisation which occurred. Academy trusts are a form of privatisation of schools. Essentially, once a school becomes an academy, and they're bribed to become an academy, you'll get more money from the government if you become an academy. So often schools felt they had to do this because they couldn't keep going. About 8 trustees take control. These 8 trustees are not elected. They're not chosen from a wide pool. They're just friends of the people who run the trust. They tend to be an accountant, a local businessman, maybe the odd token woman. You try and make sure one of the 8's female. You might even have somebody who's not white. They're all well off. When I look at the trustees of academy trusts, I tend to find that half of them are company directors. The companies they're directors of often have no employees. It's basically a form of tax evasion.
Okay.
You and I could set up a company, and if we set up a company, it would look kosher because, we otherwise don't know each other. We could be both directors, and we could go out for a meal, and we could call it a business meeting. so we wouldn't have to pay for the meal. We just put it off against tax. Anyway, that's the kind of people who become trustees of academy schools. It's unpleasant. I mean, it's not just wrong. It's unpleasant. And when you look at who it is, very often they're sending their own child to a private school. It's not a school for theirs. It's an awful mess. There's enormous corruption on average in academies. More and more of it's being revealed because there's no proper scrutiny from outside. But there's also no democratic control. It doesn't belong to the local area or the local people. A school becomes a charitable object that's placed in the area where your betters run it because you couldn't possibly be involved in running the school.
Yeah. And so what do you think we should do about this mess in education? I mean, both in terms of student loans that are ripping people off and in terms of academies.
Well, in a way, they've mucked it up so badly that it's relatively easy to do something about it. You know, if the Conservatives and the Liberals who were involved had been cleverer, they'd have managed it more. They wouldn't have just gone all out for this. But they haven't. So for universities, it is relatively simple. You need to have a political party in power who believes in no fees and no loans. That's very, very easy. Scotland have it. Right? That, you know, if you think it's not possible, Scotland have it. No fees, no loans in Scotland. Yeah. We have a political party in England that has a policy of no fees, no loans the day after they are elected. The slightly harder thing is you have to work out how you will cap the existing outstanding loans. Otherwise, nobody's going to go to university the year before an election, because why on earth would you go when you can wait? But it's possible to work out how to cap the outstanding loans so that anybody who went in 2012, which is the first year of the big fees, has their loan capped at the most that anybody who went the year before might pay, and anybody who goes the year before a Labour government were elected goes for free. All of that it's not just possible, it is in either the current practice in Scotland or the manifesto of the main opposition party in Britain. So that's there.
Yep.
Schools are more difficult because of the legal mess that's being created, and there isn't a clear model of what you would replace it by. So we need to work out a model of what you would replace academies by. You could just go back to local education authorities, but they weren't perfect. So you could think of doing something better.
Yeah. And you've talked in your book about the governance system at Oxford and how staff can be more involved in decision making alongside parents or children, users, and a sort of equivalent way that could work in schools.
I think we should think, in the past, progressive politics thought of an idea that seemed to be almost impossible. So in the 30s, they talked about schools that everybody could go to. And then they fought for 30 years, and then in the late 60s, they began to get them in. So we should be working out, what do we actually want? We've got the whole of the mainland of Europe to look for better examples.
Yep.
They all do better education than we do. So it's not hard. You know, if we were producing children who were amazingly good at maths and were learning 6 languages and went on to be brilliant, it would be difficult. But as we're actually at the bottom of the European League table in terms of educational outcomes, almost whatever we do, other than the stupidity we've done, and the sad thing is, part of the reason we've done these stupid things like academy change is our education system's been so bad. Mm-hmm. So it had an effect of even the Labour peer now who invented the academy idea, which was kind of nice for poor schools. If he'd had a better education rather than Keble College, Oxford in the 1970s, he wouldn't have made a muck up of it. It's not his fault, it's his education.
Because, you've talked a lot in the book about how we're so elitist and we're so used to the concept of, a few people who've been Oxford educated, Cambridge educated, telling us what to do.
Leave it to them, yes.
Leave it to them. How do we get out of that? Because one of the things we're thinking about with public ownership is how do we make it more participatory? But of course, we need to get rid of this idea that some people are quality. You talk about quality people and non-quality people.
Talented
how do we make sure everybody feels like they can contribute and they've got the confidence?
Devolution is one. So Wales and Scotland work these things out themselves.
Yeah.
You can obviously begin to do the same thing within England. It's far too large an area to have a single policy.
Yeah.
There will be different policies that work in different areas. So if you take a town like Oxford, which has about 6 large state secondary schools, they're near enough to each other that they can be partly run together. So you could have, in effect, legally a single school in Oxford with 6 sites. Teachers can then move between the sites and so on, because we have incredible inequalities between those state schools in the city. What you do in a rural area is very different. What you do on the East Coast when you just have 3 schools is different. What you do in those parts of the country where you actually need some children to board because nobody lives near enough. It's very rare. The Scottish Islands have children boarding because you can't provide a secondary school on an island. So there are lots and lots of good reasons to have some devolution in education.
Yeah.
But what you have to watch out if you do that is you'll have some particularly regressive places that try not to be modern.
Yeah.
And in the past, these are the counties that, for instance, kept grammar schools.
Right.
So devolution is good, but don't allow somebody to be nasty to the majority of their children because of some wrong idea they've got about genetics and eugenics.
Yeah. Well, this is something that we're thinking about. How does the local, regional and national levels, how do they work together?
Yeah.
And I guess maybe there's something about national standards and frameworks alongside a lot of devolution of powers and funding and control.
Yeah, there are different ways. The German model's interesting. The Länder have huge amounts of power. You know, you might moan about what Bavaria does and it's not as exciting as other places. But like I say, we have a whole continent that we can look to for the level at which it makes sense. Universities should be a part of their local city. And so you've got to work out how do you help make them a part of that city properly. They are, in Scotland, part of their cities, and they are in most of Europe. It's normal for a large number, if not the majority of children who decide to go on to university to go to the same university as the city they live in. It's going to take us a long time to get to that in Britain because we've created a colonial model of universities where you must leave home to kind of be educated differently so you can be sent out to run an empire. And this university and our school system's the same. The reason for the public schools and the grammar schools was it created you a population who are very efficient for controlling a quarter of the world. Brutal, nasty, arrogant, effective. Once you've no longer got an empire, having that school and university system is embarrassing, upsetting and wrong.
Yeah. And what would you do here in Oxford in terms of how it's set up and how the sort of divide between town and gown?
Oh, well, for the schools, for the schools in Oxford, they're currently literally owned by different academy trusts. One has one has another. The head of the trust is earning £200,000 and sends their children to school. It costs £30,000 a year and has a car that the children gawp at because it is so expensive. That has to go. You could keep the name Academy Trust, but you do it geographically, so the 6 schools that are near each other become one because teachers can move between nearby schools. Even pupils, if you make Oxford safe, can move between schools and sites. And you make the ownership collective so that this division within a city is reduced. And then you do things like you begin to specialise science on one site so that the children of Oxford can go to that site for the best labs. At that point, children going to some of the private schools might just realise that the labs are better there. We have a huge private state school divide in Oxford. About a third of the 15-year-olds go private. The divide is largely based on stupidity, in that in the past, most children from a private school go to university, from a state school maybe just 2%. Now half the children from the state schools are going to university, so the money's being wasted in the private school. You just both end up at Manchester University. It's just the sad thing is that's where you meet, because you don't meet and socialise in Oxford. But I wouldn't ban private schools. I would simply rearrange the state education so that the cleverer parents could realise not to waste their money and segregate their children.
Okay.
The universities, now Oxford's got 2, that's hard because we've gone backwards. Oxford had 2 universities before. One was just called the Polytechnic and it took local children. So you could go to university within Oxford if you grew up in Oxford. You can't do that anymore unless you're a bit weird and you get 6 A stars and May A, whatever. and even Brooks, is AAA, and it's actually posher in terms of student background than Oxford University. It's the hardest nut to crack. You have to begin to crack it to work out how you're going to do it. Oxford cannot be a black hole. The term black hole was used for those parts of the country that lack a university. Most of those parts of the country that lack a university don't have one at all. Oxford has two, but as far as most people are concerned, there isn't one here at all. You've got to go somewhere else. We have Ruskin, which is the third tiny higher education institute. And it's not doing very well, but if you wanted to create a local university, you could begin with the model of Ruskin, which is owned by the trade unions and by its members. The majority of students at this university are postgraduate, not undergraduate. The majority of them are paying fees, usually well over £20,000 a year. So this is completely privatised education. And at least recognising you've got that problem that you never realised you had is a start.
Yeah.
Then you need to begin to work out what you do about it. You need to start getting some people in who are there on merit, not because of their wealth. And that requires raising money to be able to do that. And then you begin to mix them. But it's a long, long slog. We've suddenly created another tier of inequality that didn't exist before. There were very few postgraduate students in Oxford when I was a child.
Right.
We've created a brand new education sector for the children of the 1%, because that's the only group who can afford the fees.
And they don't get funding. There's not much funding around.
There's almost no funding.
Yeah.
They have to pay the fees.
Yeah.
They get no money for maintenance.
Right.
The rents are highest in this city.
Yeah.
Mum and Dad have to have an awful lot of money for you to do a postgraduate degree at Oxford.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what would you do anything about the land, the college land?
Well, it varies. There's 30 odd colleges. Some own very little land. The college I'm in alone owns about 11 small properties around the city. Others, when you see the list has been Freedom of Information opened, own thousands of land. If I was advising the Chancellor of the Exchequer of a progressive government who was taking over in a period of austerity and cuts and disarray, I would suggest a windfall tax on the wealth of the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, as we had windfall taxes in the past on the oil industry and so on, and that would help solve the problem. It's a problem for the colleges. The rich colleges don't know what to do with their wealth, and the other colleges keep on saying you should share it out. Now, it would make much more sense to share it with everybody, not just within the colleges, but actually everybody in the country.
Across universities. Across
universities, but also helping to fund for the education of children who are asylum seekers in the school. Mm-hmm. This is charitable. You have to remember all these colleges are charities. So of course they want to do good. They're educational charities.
Yep.
They should love the idea of being good for education. And owning fields worth thousands of pounds is not an educational aim. Yep.
You've talked in this book about public service workers and the workers that we're going to need in the future potentially. And you talked a bit about how we need more social workers and ideally fewer people working in prisons and fewer accountants.
Yes.
And that feels very...
I should say on the accountants, some of our best friends are accountants, but we have an amazingly high number of accountants.
Yeah.
I think somebody has worked out, I think you can add up the qualified accountants of many, many European countries and find that they have less than us.
Yeah.
And they still manage to do things quite well, whereas we have an obsession with accounting. And of course, a lot of accountants in Britain are essentially employed to help people avoid paying their taxes.
Yeah.
And that's inefficient.
Yeah.
It's a waste of a life. Can you imagine spending your life helping other people not contribute to the common good?
Yeah. And yet we have desperately overstretched, people working in the NHS or in social work or in many public services where we actually need more workers.
Yeah. We're going to need, as we age, we're going to need more people in the caring professions. And it can be a very worthwhile and rewarding job as long as you're not underfunded and you can do it properly. Helping somebody the age of your parents have a nicer and happier life in the last 10 years of their life compared to helping somebody much better off than you avoiding paying for the school place of another child in the country so they can have another holiday. What's going to make you happy?
Yeah. we also need a culture shift, don't we? So at the moment you talk about how, you know,
Yeah.
the story of the failure of Southern Cross was reported as a business story when actually it's a health story, and that's what we see quite a lot when people are talking about privatisation. Is we see stories in the FT, stories about the markets,
Yeah.
because we have all of these markets in public services where we say they don't belong.
Yeah. Well, and this is an odd thing about this country where we're extreme. So we have a history of talking about investments and where are investments capital. And that's partly the British Empire. Your investments would be in the East India Company and they would do very well for you. So other countries have less of a talk of this kind of, because they didn't have things they owned outside where money simply just kept on rolling in. So that you would think of the care system for the elderly not as a business opportunity, but actually as a service, and often provided very locally, not giant chains of care home operators owned by a hedge fund, renting from a set of landlords who are also owned by another hedge fund, squeezing every last pound out, so it costs you a fortune to be in a grotty care home, and they cut the staff so there's only one poor person working at night who's not strong enough to get you back into the bed.
Yeah.
That's you put the profit motive into something, and occasionally you can get something very good out of it. Clothing is always the example where, you know, we've had state clothing in the past, it has not been good. I think the way you've got to start with these things, because if you just say we should have public ownership, people say, oh, you're a zealot, you just believe in this. The thing is determining the line of maximum economic efficiency. And public ownership for things like education and health is more efficient.
Yeah.
Even the 1% know this.
Yeah.
All the top schools they send their top schools they send their children to are charities, because they know the minute you hand the profit over to an educator, they become badly behaved. But some things are better provided by a private market, and clothes is the ultimate example of that. But books, you know, a state publisher would be a very draconian, boring thing. It's precarious working in publishing. You know, it's not a life I would like. But there are millions of people who want to write books. I think publishing is best done privately. Although we have a mixture, we have university presses which are partly charitable, and the fascinating thing is, where is this line of greatest efficiency?
Yeah.
The area where the line crosses is housing. And housing is a really interesting mix around the world. It never works if it's all state, and it never works if it's all private. But getting the mix right is difficult. Some countries do it much, much better than others. Austria and Vienna is a good example of a place that's done it quite well.
That's really interesting. We don't talk about housing because we only talk about public services where we're sure that they should be fully in public ownership.
Yeah.
And we say that's because they're things where you need some democratic accountability, where you often have natural monopolies and things that are meeting really important needs for people in society. So they tick all of those boxes.
Yeah.
And arguably you might want to have some private housing in the mix. So I'm interested to hear that. But that's a bigger topic.
Yeah.
One more question. What are your 3 favourite public services and why?
Oh, which do I really like the most that currently exist? I mean, so much has been taken away that it's tricky. Of what we got, I like the civil service.
That's an unusual answer.
Yep, but it is a public service.
Absolutely.
People are amazingly well behaved in the civil service. They, you know, will do things, not awful things, but they will behave in a way that democratically elected politicians tell them to do. And they are our ultimate line of defence in the case of disaster. They're the ones we actually rely. If there are giant floods, it'll be the civil servants. If there's a hard Brexit, it's the civil servants who will actually be the ones making sure the food arrives. So the civil service first. Then what is left of state education. And, you know, the academisation of schools has only just begun. So they've only just begun to corrupt those schools. But the idea of people dedicating their lives to spending many, many hours in classrooms with children, it is extremely hard and it's emotionally draining in a way that here, if a colleague of mine is a bit upset, I might be a bit emphasis, but if a 6-year-old's upset, it's very different. And the last would be the end of life. And it really isn't that much of a public service. Hospices, but also the geriatric wards, if I'm lucky and I don't die quickly of a heart attack and I live longer, I'm going to be in one of those.
Yeah.
And I've seen the empathy of people who choose to work there. And it's, whereas you can say, I work in a primary school and everybody says how wonderful you are, not many people say, yesterday I helped 3 people die as they got older. But it's just as important.
Yeah. And the empathy really came through in this book. It was such a pleasure to read. And it really reminded me, because we think about privatisation and public ownership, and I don't think that much about austerity day to day, but this is just, it's really powerful stuff.
Thank you.
Can we just also finish on your quote from the last page about change and how it happens?
Yeah.
Maybe you could just read it.
I have to get my glasses.
Okay.
I can't read about that.
Yeah.
Should we get
From there.
Yeah.
Okay. You'll see how bad I am at reading. Didn't learn to read till I was 8. When change truly happens, it at first strikes seasoned commentators as frankly impossible, a pipe dream, and then undesirable, and full of negative consequences, and then just about possible. Once the clamour for change becomes overwhelming, we finally get change. And when we finally get change, their memories change with it. They will say that they believed in the change as desirable all along, that they saw something like it coming, and that they too were on the right side of history. And then we can all forget that just a few years ago they had so vehemently opposed the change, that they had justified the status quo, that they were so very scornful, and that they were ultimately wrong. That matters little. It's just history. What matters is ensuring that we are now at the peak and starting on our way down. And it's a long way down.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.